how can NATO be considered the military threat if they are the ones who haven't targeted Russia when they could have plenty of times done so?
They may be difficult people for us working in NATO, but they are not idiots. Even at the 90s that you mentioned, there was still this factor of nuclear weapons that we possess. And of course, attacking Russia, which was much weaker at that moment from the point of view of conventional weapons, we didn't have such sophisticated weapons systems that we have right now. But in any case, we had nuclear weapons, and they understood that any strike on Russia, which would threaten the existence of my country, trigger a retaliating strike. Of course, for military planners of NATO, this was not a scenario that they wanted to implement.
This is the Global Gambit.
Welcome back to the program, everyone. This is the Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the strategy behind geopolitics, economics, international relations, and we talk about a lot of different things between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And someone who I've been intending to have on for a while, but timings just have not worked out until now, is Dmitry Polyanskiy, who is the Russian permanent representative to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, a position he relatively recently took up after being the first deputy permanent representative to the United Nations. Dmitry, it's a pleasure to have you on, and I think this is going to be a very dynamic conversation. Now, you've just started into a position which is one of the few organizations that still has Russia as a participant. It hasn't been sidelined or suspended or something like that. And so I'm quite interested to understand, what is it you're doing on a daily basis? What are you trying to do to engage Russian and European diplomats on various issues?
Thank you, Pyotr. This is a pleasure for me to be at your show. This was indeed planned for quite a long time. I'm happy that we finally succeeded. You're absolutely right. I am now heading our mission to the OSCE. This organization now is not at its best period of time. It used to be pan-European. It used to be seen as a platform for dialogue, as a platform for exploring different security equations that would make our continent more sure, more safe. There were very high hopes at the beginning of the 90s that this organization will bring us to a better world. There were different projects of European security which were pinned on this organization. But unfortunately, it all came to a result which we can't be satisfied with today. For many reasons. We have maybe our own viewpoint, maybe not the whole of the world would share our viewpoint, but we are absolutely sure that we in Russia did everything in our capacity, in our force that should make our world better, that the positions of everybody would be taken on force. We think that the security system that was imposed on us after the end of the Cold War is not fair. It doesn't take into account Russian interests. It is based on permanent enlargement of NATO. NATO is a pinpoint of Western concept of European security. We do not share this position. We think that this European security should be indivisible. No one should ensure its security at the expense of the security of the others. And this is the notion that is included in a lot of documents and basic documents of OSCE. Unfortunately, it's not implemented in good faith and was never implemented in good faith as we understand right now. But to cut the long story short, after 2022, this organization has been absolutely abused by Western countries. And you know that there are 57 members of the OSCE, and it's not like at the United Nations where I was, where Western countries today seem sticking together to each other, but representing a minority in the world politics. There, of course, in this organization, they stick together and they clearly are a majority, and they try to impose their views on everybody, including Russia. They are very mad at Russia sometimes. They try to speak out, but the problem is that they, in order to do so, they have banned a lot of rules. For example, the sacred rule of consensus, which is the backbone of this organization, and imposed certain decisions on everybody, which put the future of this organization at a very high risk. The meaning of this organization is for everybody to sit and to speak, to implement projects. Very important part of this organization are confidence-building measures, transparency measures, and this is virtually non-existent today as a result of this very short-sighted Western policy. So my mission here would be to explore what can be done with this organization, to which extent our Western neighbors, European neighbors, are ready to create something in common, to take into consideration our security concerns, and to kind of pass to a new stage, if not of cooperation, but at least to peaceful coexistence in Europe, which would be in the interests of everybody.
As we said, this is a chat that we've been planning for a while, and inevitably I think there's going to be some divergences of opinion. But the whole point of my program is not to just talk to people who already agree with what I think or some of what I think. I've worked in the UN as well, and I've been well connected with the OSCE for a while. It's interesting to hear your perspective about how it operates as a vehicle or as a platform compared to the United Nations. But, you know, when you move there in a professional capacity, and I don't know if you're here in a professional or personal capacity, you know, what are you expecting to achieve? A lot of Europe is fairly united against the Ukraine war. But that being said, there is a growing divergence of opinions over the Iran war and whether or not the United States Kingdom should get involved, France should get involved. Belgium made comments about normalizing ties with Russia. So as someone who works in your position in the OSCE, how do you nurture those relationships? Who do you look to as people you can try to engage? Do you not bother with the British or the French because they're not, you know, going to be as open to engagement? Or you try to talk to more, undecided partners, neutral partners like the Austrians or Hungarians or something?
Well, answering your last question, Pyotr, I have no problems of connecting with my counterparts here in my capacity as a representative, but these contacts are not public. They are not made in order to kind of, show off and to display to the outside world that we are having this or that conversation, which wouldn't be possible elsewhere, even in New York, not to mention any bilateral configuration. No, this is not for this that I'm here. So I could tell you simply that I would say the vast majority of my colleagues here are not against engaging. They are not against discussing things, difficult things, but there is a group of countries, I suspect that you might have an idea of who these countries are, that are absolutely not willing to engage in any form, that stick to the position that Russia is the universal evil and that you can't speak with my country in any way. The only way is to defeat it, to punish it, to dismember it, whatever. So there is such a group of countries that do not engage. Again, I will not tell you any names. I think that's enough to understand that I'm not idle here. I have contacts, I have conversations. I try to make our position known and to explain our reasoning. The main divide, is a lot of countries. Well, first of all, nobody is saying that war is good. Nobody is saying that war is Ukraine is good. We try to avert this war for many years. And, our reasoning, you might agree with it or not agree, that we came there in 2022 to stop the war, which was ongoing from 2014. And we made an effort before in the form of Minsk agreements to accommodate both concerns of Ukraine and concerns of the population, Russian-speaking population in the East. This was a good formula, provided it would be implemented in good faith. Unfortunately, it wasn't. We all know today that this was just a smokescreen for arming Ukraine and for preparing it for a war with Russia. This was acknowledged by a number of former politicians, you know it. So then we made a number of diplomatic overtures. We made proposals to discuss this treaty on European security to NATO, to the US at the end of 2021. We repeatedly warned that bad things are coming when Ukraine was preparing to join NATO, when Ukraine was preparing to acquire nuclear weapons, which Zelensky said openly at the beginning of 2022. When it all failed, we had to act. And again, we can discuss this situation in detail because I remember it quite well. But the fact is that today, these countries, most of European countries, I would say, they claim that the history before 2022 didn't exist. They start their, I would say, narrative, anti-Russian narrative from 2022, as if out of the blue, unexpectedly, Russia, by its own decision, decided to attack Ukraine. I don't know why. Maybe because we have a few territory, very little territory, and we need more. Maybe just because we hate Ukrainians. So there are very many crazy theories which are all wrong. But we came there to defend the interests of our compatriots, stop the blatant violations of human rights, to stop this discriminatory approach towards Russian-speaking population, which we see continuing today. And instead of kind of trying to address the root causes of this problem, instead of finding a long-term solution to this problem, all of a sudden our European neighbors are transformed into Russia haters, into Russophobes, and all those things that we hoped were absolutely not present in European countries, such countries as Germany, after the Second World War, all of a sudden came to the surface. And we can't recognize our European neighbors anymore. We see that there is very harsh and, I would say, radical anti-Russian rhetoric still dominating in a lot of countries. There are still efforts, instead of finding a long-term and sustainable solution to Ukrainian crisis, there are still efforts to kind of corner Russia, to punish Russia, to dismember Russia. Some of the European politicians are saying this quite openly. And instead of this, they are trying to undermine the peaceful efforts that are being made. And what is most worrying for me is that against this backdrop, we have very clear, very targeted campaign in European countries of a preparation to a war with Russia, which they say is imminent. They promote the narrative that Russia would attack inevitably in 3, 4, 5 years, that Russia is an enemy, that Europe needs to rearm, that Europe needs to prepare for this confrontation with Russia. The narrative that we hear today in Europe, there are no attempts to find any common grounds with Russia, to acknowledge the fact that Russia is an important neighbor and a player, at least regional player, as far as Europe is concerned. This is the most worrying trend for me, because if nothing happens, if we are where we are, I have absolutely no doubts that we will have a new European war in a short perspective, and not because Russia wants it. It's because of this reckless policy of NATO and EU and some specific capitals, first and foremost Paris, Berlin, London, who are warmongering and who are actually bringing about the future European war. And that's a very worrying trend for me, and I will try to do my best to revert this trend. But so far, my colleagues are not very forthcoming. They camp to their positions, and I think that this is very reckless and this is very dangerous.
So I'll start by saying what I appreciate. I've always been somewhat critical or conscious of the expansion of NATO, that the West collectively, the West or the US especially, didn't do enough to reassure Russia over its security concerns, the encroachment of its western flank and southern flank. I think it was rather unnecessary of George Bush to talk about the inevitable ascension of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, because I think that triggered an unnecessary response in Moscow. But the counterpoint that people who are, Western leaning will say is that NATO is a voluntary organization and countries wanted to join it in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's dissolution because they felt it was a security assurance against potential resurgence of, Russia's ambitions to sort of encourage or coerce smaller groups of people, especially ethnic Russians or ethnic speaking Russians, to be part of Russia. So, the people say that NATO grew because countries wanted to join, not because NATO wanted to sort of encircle Russia. I also agree that I think that there is unnecessary commentary sometimes. As you know, maybe you've watched some of my content, or some people who watch me know that I speak to a degree on both sides. I have a lot of people I speak to who are very pro-Ukraine, but unrealistic in what will happen with the war. Russia sort of breaks up into lots of countries. I think that's rather preposterous. But I also speak to people who are from Russia or pro-Russian or Russian sympathetic. But then, and this is where I lead into a question for you, is simply, do you not think it's a little bit unfair to say that all Europe is saying is about dismembering or war with Russia when there are quite a few efforts to engage over peace? I mean, Macron often says we need to engage Russia whether or not we like it. There are quite a few pragmatists in the country. Meloni, she's not even, she's quite sympathetic to Russia, but she's also pro-Ukraine sovereignty. So how does that make sense to you, to say that no one wants to speak to Russia when there are quite a few people who say that they should, or we should?
I analyze the facts, not the intentions, but the facts. The fact is that there is no meaningful, or meaningful maybe is too much of a word, no dialogue at all. There is no bilateral connections. I know that my colleagues, some of European capitals, including London, for example, are totally isolated from official communication with their counterparts. With some capitals, the messaging is happening through the United Nations, if it's an emergency situation, or through Vienna, through OSCE. There are also such situations, but not bilaterally, not in Moscow, not in London, not in Berlin, not in Paris. I think that's not normal, first and foremost. Again, I respect different points of view. I have no problem of discussing this situation with people who do not share my views, provided they are respectful and that they really speak about facts and not promoting some propaganda messages about my country, unfounded propaganda message. So, but there is no dialogue even on this. They just say that they don't want to speak anything with Russia, about anything with Russia, because Russia did the most terrible thing in world history. I'm not exaggerating. It's what I heard. That the most terrible thing that happened anywhere, anytime in history was Russian aggression against Ukraine, as they frame it. And again, they claim that it happened out of the blue, that there were absolutely nothing in the run-up to it. And you mentioned NATO. NATO could have been part of a solution and not part of a problem. But unfortunately, after the Cold War, there was this choice of reinforcing this bloc, as you rightly said, with concerns about Russia. So in anticipation that Russia will be a threat to NATO, that Russia will be an enemy, this was logical to NATO, because NATO existed as a counterweight to Warsaw Treaty when Warsaw Treaty was no longer there. Of course, for such a bloc as NATO, it was necessary to find a foe, to find an enemy. And they did it step by step, despite all the efforts to find some common area for cooperation, despite NATO-Russia Council, despite all the OSCE framework. They managed to come to a situation that they have right now, when Russia is an outright enemy and when the whole bloc is trying to mobilize, is trying to build up militarily against Russia. And this is despite a number of efforts that we made. I think that our president disclosed himself that there was an attempt of Russia applying to be a NATO member, which would, of course, totally transform the whole bloc. I myself, when I started my diplomatic service, it was in 1994. I remember when President Yeltsin at this time also wanted to join NATO. And I think that if it happened, of course, the world would have been different and our relations with our European neighbors would have been different in such a constellation. Because the idea after the Cold War was to build a better world, not Russia against everybody, not United States against everybody, but a better world. Because we, as at the Soviet Union, I remember it as a child, we also invested a lot of things in this end of the Cold War. Our leaders made a lot of steps, which they hoped would be reciprocal from the Western part. And now we have a lot of evidence pointing out to the promises that were made and guarantees that were given to my country at this moment, and they all were broken. So it was very, I would say, trust-breaking exercise. And instead of building something on top of it, instead of, for example, merging, I don't know, OSCE, which was not existing at that moment, but there was this conference of security and cooperation in Europe. It became organization only in 1995. But instead of merging it with NATO, for example, instead of creating some platform for European security with Russia, they started to do it knowingly, to target it against Russia. And that was a big strategic mistake. It developed step by step, year by year. It was coming. You remember the eye-opening speech of my president in 2007 when he all of a sudden told everything he thought about what was wrong and how to mend it. What happened after this in 2007? Georgia, which was a big provocation on the part of NATO, and now the current Georgian authorities absolutely acknowledge it, saying that Saakashvili was a tool in the hands of the West. You may accept it or not accept it, but it shows that instead of building something together, the efforts were aimed at creating something anti-Russian. And of course, the situation on the eve of Ukrainian situation, of the Ukrainian crisis, was the apex of these efforts. We need to come to terms, we need to find a common understanding of why it happened and to make sure that it never happens again, that there wouldn't be such kind of meddling to the internal affairs of the countries, such anti-Russian projects, or I don't know, anti-any other country projects on the borders, which is absolutely contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, to everything that we have in common. We need to come to terms on this. And instead of this, European countries, most of the European countries are absolutely reckless, and they are building up military potential. They are preparing to the war with Russia, regardless of the fact that they contradict themselves on many occasions. One day they are saying that Russia is very slow in advancing in Ukraine because Russia is weak, that this is a war of attrition and Russia is absolutely exhausted and our military-industrial complex is making its last efforts. In the same article, you can find reference that the ultimate goal of Russia would be to attack NATO. Where is the logic here? If we are so weak, if we really are at the end of our capacities in Ukraine, so where is the logic? What is the point of us to attack NATO, which is much stronger militarily than we are, which is more numerous in terms of manpower? So I don't see any logic in this. It's just, to creating a kind of a bugbear out of Russia, saying that Russia is a threat, that everything that European countries should do is unite against Russia. It's not a positive agenda. It's a very reckless, negative agenda, which brings our continent to nowhere. And that is worrying, regardless of whether you share Russian point of view or not share Russian point of view. I think that the most necessary thing that we should do right now is to sit together, to talk and try to sort out our differences. I'm not speaking about Ukrainian situation. I'm speaking about a bigger picture. Ukrainian situation is only part of this bigger picture. It's a part of the bigger European security crisis, which happened even earlier than 2022. So we need to find a way out of this. And instead of this, Europeans are still sticking to their previous agenda. The new administration opened its eyes to a certain extent. It understands the necessity of interacting with Russia, and here it is not on the same page with a lot of European countries, but European countries are still blind and they are walking into this abyss with closed eyes, thinking that they are doing the right thing for them. I don't know whether it's sincere or whether they are just, being manipulated by somebody, but that's the reality we have to face.
So we have limited time. So, I would appreciate doing this again, but maybe we can find a particular angle to deep dive into one specific part of the history or something. But for the time being, just to piggyback off a couple of things you said. So, yes, I'm very well aware of Putin's speech in 2007. It's considered by many as the turning point, or the first of a few turning points in NATO, Western Russian relations. But again, I mean, you yourself mentioned it, the NATO-Russia Council, the founding act of 1997, at the time when Putin really loved NATO, to quote George Robertson, the former Secretary General of the early 2000s, a British diplomat, as I'm sure you're familiar with, right? These seem to differ slightly with what you're saying, that there wasn't any effort to engage Russia. And I appreciate that Europe is militarizing, yes, but that's because they have a very militarized nation state to their right now. I think we live in a different world now, broadly, where the Europeans need to be more strategically autonomous of anyone, not just Russia or China, but also America and anything, right? So I wouldn't put that purely down to their warmongering. But I guess, to put this into something for you to debate over is, I'll come to the crux of it. One of the biggest beliefs from the Russian perspective is that Ukraine was being overly westernized or at risk from American influence. A lot of people see the war in Ukraine as a tug of war between Western or European values and Russian values, and therefore Russia wanted to ensure that Ukraine couldn't join NATO, because if it's in conflict, it can't join NATO, to prevent it from being part of the European Union, because that would mean a lot of Ukrainians felt more well off, right? And so the Russians tried to incentivize Ukraine to stay orientated towards Russia, but in the end, that wasn't working. So they resorted to coercion. I presume you're not going to agree with such a take, but explain to me the Russian perspective over Ukraine and this tug of war between greater forces.
I worked in Brussels in our mission to the European Union in 2001, 2004, and we were working on common spaces, and one of the common space was common space of external security. And in the preamble to this common space, it was written, and we agreed to this at that time, that our neighbors shouldn't be put in a position of choice between Russia and European Union, because both are important for them. And that was, I would say, the key factor of successful interaction and good neighborhood between Russia and European Union. And Ukraine, of course, was the most benefiting country of such an arrangement. But unfortunately, things went wrong after that. And there was this big enlargement of 2004 when a lot of different countries joined European Union with their voices, with their perspectives. Then there was this Eastern Partnership, which excluded Russia absolutely from cooperation with European Union. A lot of steps. We can discuss this later on in detail, all these things which led up to the situation when we are now. But we were ready. It was not about kind of, re-winning Ukraine, merging Ukraine with Russia, bringing Ukraine to the economic union with Russia, Belarus, and the others, as many people claim. No, it was just to have our neighbors at our borders that would be peaceful, that would not be threatening us, that would be not member of any bloc. Actually, that was the basis on which Russia recognized Ukraine after its independence. There was a treaty between Russia and Ukraine, and there were clear things, especially about not joining any military bloc, about Russian language, all these things. They just needed to implement them. But all of a sudden, there was this project, anti-Russian project in Ukraine, implemented at least since 2014, but in my understanding, a little bit earlier, which started to threaten the very basics of our relations. And this was not promoted by us. We were happy with Ukraine the way it was. It was promoted by the West. It was promoted by Western countries. There were a lot of things that we didn't want and we couldn't tolerate in Ukraine after it started developing and taking this new course, absolutely anti-Russian course. From Russian language, which is still the native language for majority of Ukrainians, to the heroization of Nazi criminals, which is very obvious for us even today. It has become much worse. So these things are absolutely intolerable for us. You can't have a neighbor that is doing such things to you. And we just wanted to have a normal, peace-loving neighbor at our borders. And unfortunately, because of the meddling from Western countries, this was no longer possible. And one more thing you mentioned when you said that there was a NATO-Russia, showed the true colors of NATO. And that was a very much divorce moment, I would say, in our relations with NATO, whether we wanted it or not. So you shouldn't omit this very important element of the narrative when you speak about NATO-Russia relations. I hope I was useful in answering your questions. Again, I'm absolutely open to speaking on any subject that you want. On historic perspective, I was involved in a lot of things that happened during these 25, 30 years in world diplomacy, in European diplomacy, and if it's interesting to know my position, my perspective, I'm at your disposal entirely, and I don't expect you to share our position 100%. It's up to your viewers to make conclusions and to decide whether my arguments are really worth taking into consideration or not.
Well, I have one last quick question for you,
Good.
Dmitry,
Sure.
which is simply, you mentioned it yourself. You've worked on these issues for 25, 30 years. My lifespan, when you started working diplomatic service and doing what you said you were doing in 94, well, that was when I just started inhabiting Europe and this complicated what I was simply just say though, but in that time frame, NATO had many opportunities to go militarily at Russia, but they didn't, and they haven't. Yes, they've been involved in operations in the Baltics, in the Balkans, in Kosovo, in the Middle East, but not in Russia. So, and then Russia's the one though that invades Georgia, that invades Ukraine, undertakes this military operation. How can NATO be considered the military threat if they are the ones who haven't targeted Russia when they could have plenty of times done so?
They may be difficult people for us working in NATO, but they're not idiots. And even at the 90s that you mentioned, there was still this factor of nuclear weapons that we possess. And of course, attacking Russia, which was much weaker at that moment from the point of view of conventional weapons, we didn't have such sophisticated weapons and systems that we have right now. But in any case, we had nuclear weapons, and they understood and that any strike on Russia, which would threaten the existence of my country, trigger a retaliating strike. Of course, for military planners of NATO, this was not a scenario that they wanted to implement. But it's if we're speaking about the conventional warfare, I mean the conventional military logic. But there was a hybrid war against my country led by NATO for many, many years. I can give you a number of examples. Well, Ukraine, by the way, and Georgia is one of the examples. It's not necessarily to fight directly your opponent in today's world. So you just need to create problems at the borders, and you need to create these hornet nests at the borders, which another country will have to eradicate, spending resources, money, and so on. NATO is fighting the war with Russia right now with the hands of Ukrainians. So we're absolutely sure that Ukrainians will not be able to resist if NATO was not behind them. You remember that Russian army in a number of days, compatriot Boris Johnson came there and convinced them of continuing to fight. So there are many examples of how NATO engaged against Russia. You can take the situation in Chechnya, for example. There were 2 Chechen wars, and there are a lot of facts of foreign involvement in Chechnya, of the formations that were prepared by Western countries, involvement in training of jihadists, of whoever, who in 1999, for example, when Putin was prime minister, attacked Dagestan. And that was a turning point in the Chechen war. And there were a lot of facts of Western involvement in this crisis. So there was a hybrid war. Russia was always an opponent for NATO. But some of the leaders, some of those who were taking decisions, were smart enough to keep their opinion non-public. Today, the tide has turned, and today everybody in NATO, everybody in European Union, almost everybody is speaking about Russia as an enemy. This is an open warfare against my country. This is an open hybrid war, and that's the only difference. Unfortunately, this war never stopped since, I don't know, let's say 99, maybe even earlier. We can doubt about it, but it's not that all of a sudden a very friendly bloc decided to help Ukraine because Ukraine was again out of the blue attacked by crazy Russia, which wanted more land. This is a story for a Hollywood blockbuster maybe, but not for our real life. And I think that all those who have brains and who have some historic experience and who really want to analyze things, not to take them what is being fed to them by the others, but to analyze and to process them, they understand that there were reasons for what happened in 2022. And again, my appeal to everybody is to analyze by themselves and to help the world survive and to avoid such situations, which can be done only by addressing these root causes, addressing the problems that brought us to this situation, to make amends, to draw lessons from this. That's the only way. And that's our appeal here. And that's my message here to my colleagues as well.
Well, I think we're going to have to call it time on this conversation. Unfortunately, Dmitry, there's obviously more things that as we speak, you mentioned points that I want to ask you further or debate you on more. But I would simply say, yes, I think that there's a lot that history shows about the interference of Western countries in other states of affairs. But I would equally point to Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Tel Aviv. Everyone does it. So I don't think that the West is necessarily any different like that. Maybe they just have a slightly different moral radar about it. And lastly, yeah, I mean, look, I think the situation in the war is not going to change. Russia's not going anywhere. But equally, if there isn't going to be a genuine desire by the Kremlin to want to engage in a peaceful footing, because you emphasize wanting to talk peace, but then when Putin doesn't have a willingness to meet Zelensky or Trump in trilateral meetings, I find it difficult to believe. And then we have missiles landing on cities or drones intercepting a different airspace of European nations, whether or not you agree that they are Russian sourced or not. It makes people rather confused as to whether or not the intention for peace is genuine. But there's nothing I want more than peace and a constructive relationship between Russia and Europe, especially. I forget America for a second. I focus on Europe, Eurasia more broadly. That's a large focus of this channel. But I mean, you're welcome. Any last comments on that, and we can reconvene for a follow-up conversation, perhaps one day in Vienna itself. But pass back to you for.
Again, your position is being shared by a lot of people in Europe. Unfortunately, there is kind of an assumption that Russia doesn't want peace. But if you analyze the steps that we made, I can tell you that in our statement at the UN Security Council, which I was participating in writing, we always say that we prefer a diplomatic way for the resolution of this crisis. There were a number of initiatives before, in the run-up to this crisis situation, after this crisis situation, of how to meet, how to discuss things. And it's not true. We repeatedly said that we are ready. President Putin said that he is ready to meet President Zelensky. When he said that he wanted to meet President Putin, he said, okay, no problem, come to Moscow. You're very much welcome. If you want to, this is a diplomatic practice. If your initiative is to meet somebody and you propose to have a meeting, then you go and visit this person. This is a rule of diplomatic courtesy.
Why would Zelensky risk going to Moscow when they could meet somewhere like Turkey or UAE or Geneva?
Are absolutely happy to organize such a meeting. But the problem is that this shouldn't be a meeting for the sake of a meeting. It's not a PR thing there. It should be prepared. Like meetings with President Putin and President Trump were also prepared, not that they met, said, oh, hello, Vladimir, hello, Donald, how are you doing? It's being prepared by the experts. There should be a lot of things, for them to make a decision. And unfortunately, Ukrainian side does not engage at expert level. You know that there was this negotiation track in Istanbul. We were ready to continue this track, which was bilateral and direct between us and Ukrainians. They withdrew from it, saying that they are not interested in such a track. There is a genuine attempt right now by our American colleagues to bring us together and also to discuss things. But Ukrainians are obviously, they don't have any appetite to this because they are being emboldened by Europe, because they are being emboldened by those who really are afraid that there will be a decision made of Ukraine without Europe and without, of course, Zelensky, because Zelensky is also his only reason, his only aim of all these exercises is to keep his own power, which he has usurped for some time already, and he's not ready to have any elections. Everything that he's saying is just a lip service about this. Ukrainians don't have a voice. We were voting for him 19 on the assumption that he would make things better with Russia. You remember his statements when 2/3 of Ukrainians voted for him. He promised that he will not touch Russian language. He promised that he will not touch Crimea, that he will have good relations with Russia, that he spoke a lot of good things about Minsk agreements. And when people voted for him, he turned on the dime and he did everything in the opposite direction. So there are a lot of things one can discuss. The picture is not black and white, of course, it never is. Again, I am open to any meaningful conversation, any discussion. I think that your specialization is very much coinciding with what I'm doing here in Vienna, so it logically opens a lot of other opportunities for us to meet and to discuss things in Vienna or online, wherever. I'm not afraid of any topics. We can discuss everything, provided it is respectful and provided it is based on the facts and not on some cliches and claims that are not substantiated. So I wish you all the best in your endeavor and looking forward to coming to your program once again.
Likewise, Dmitry, it was a very constructive conversation, and appreciate your time and everyone watching. Well, hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next one. Take care.